correspondent for CNN and ABC News, Jean Meserve.
Good afternoon. It is great to be back with IWF to moderate today our session, Tidal Wave Changing Oceans. So first a question for you. Here you are in Australia. Show of hands, how many of you are going to the Great Barrier Reef? Fair number of you. This is a huge tourist site here in Australia, as it should be, because this is the largest living structure on the planet. You can see it from space. It's larger than Japan. It's larger than Italy. And it is home to the greatest concentration of life in the world. It is literally teeming with animals. There are 30 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises on the reef, 125 species of sharks, stingrays, and skates. That may be why I'm not going to the reef. Also 1,500 species of fish. And they all rely on this reef for food and for protection. But the reef is in trouble. There have been massive coral bleaching events in each of the past 2 years. Some experts say that over the last 30 years, 50% of the coral cover on the reef has vanished. The implications for the region's ocean food web are profound. And what is happening to this reef is happening to reefs all over the world, from Belize to Madagascar. And experts say it is a bellwether, a warning to all of us of a precipitous decline in the health of our oceans. So why should we care? Well, not only is the water a place to relax and recreate and to find inspiration, reefs help protect our shorelines. Oceans are the primary food source for 3.5 billion people in this world, and 10 to 12% of the world's jobs are in fishing and aquaculture. The oceans are important. There are many factors, of course, contributing to the deterioration of our oceans. We're going to talk about some of them today with some of the world's experts. We're going to get an assessment of where we are, a forecast of where we're going, and a prescription for what we might do to turn things around. So please join me in welcoming to the stage first Emily Woglam. Emily is Executive Vice President of the Ocean Conservancy. Welcome, Emily. Also with us today is Anna Marsden. Anna is Managing Director of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. Anna. And finally, please give a warm welcome to Emma Camp. Emma is a marine biogeochemist at the University of Technology here in Sydney. Great to have you all with us. Anna, your business is the reef.
It is. It's our customer.
Yes.
We have to serve the reef.
So tell us your assessment of what the situation is on the reef
So
right
I
now.
think you opened by saying we've lost about half the reef in 30 years. So the bad news is that actually we've lost about 50% of coral cover in the last 2 years. And that's an accumulative impact. That's back-to-back coral bleaching events. In fact, the coral reefs around the world never really had a break from warmed weather and warming oceans, and so they were never able to recover. And then at the end of the second coral bleaching event last year, around almost a year ago now, Tropical Cyclone Debbie came in and just bashed up the Whitsundays, which is a really key tourist site. So the accumulated impact of those three events has meant that across the reef, and you've got to remember, the Great Barrier Reef is huge. So it's the size of Italy, Japan, 50 million football fields. This is a big system. But across that entire system, we've lost 50% of coral cover. So that's the blunt, awful, bad news. The interesting thing for all of your lovely guests who are going to go and visit the reef is the majority, the hardest hit, is in the top third, where tourists don't really go to. There's a lot of things that will bite you and eat you and everything up there. But also the great thing about that, it's such pristine land on the adjoining reef that it has the best chance of recovery and bounce back because it's in its safest state. So we're just going to let that grow back as quickly as we can. But yeah, we are facing an uncharted new era of coral reefs in crisis.
Emma, you have dived up and down the reef. What have you seen?
So in December, I had the opportunity to travel the whole way up to the Torres Straits and back down. And as we've heard, large areas where it could really only be described as a coral graveyard. But importantly, the 50% that remains includes some of the healthiest reefs that I've been lucky enough to see anywhere. And also, even on the reefs where we've seen these impacts, we're seeing recruitment. And that gives us hope, as we've just heard, that the coral cover can be restored, at least to some level, but we need to act now.
So what did the two of you make of these predictions that by 2050 the whole reef is just going to be a pile of rubble, which some experts are saying?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of modelling that says in 30 years, if we do nothing, if we essentially all go home to our bedrooms and stick a doona over our head, we will lose the world's reefs. They just can't sustain the projected temperature of water with excess pollution, with all the stresses that we're finding in the oceans. They're too fragile. But the reality is we're not going to do nothing. We're going to do everything we can. We've gotten organised. There's roles for marine science, for tourism, for industry, for conservation groups. We will crack this. And that's why we're hopeful about the future.
I want to back up just a little bit. Emma, can you explain to us a little bit more about what a coral is? It's a very complex mechanism.
So a coral, when you look at it, looks like a rock or could be dead, but it's actually this really complex organism that we call a holobiont. Holo being whole and biont being biology, and that's because it's actually an animal. And this animal has a partner of a symbiotic algae that lives inside its tissue, and then bacteria and viruses that all come together to make this whole biology. And the coral then lays down a calcium carbonate skeleton, which forms that big structure that we can observe from space and forms, the iconic reef systems that we know.
Why should we care about them if we don't snorkel or we don't scuba dive?
So when you first said about, obviously, the food source and the number of people that rely on it, but even for people that maybe, for example, in the UK that don't have a tropical reef system there, there's economies that are fundamentally reliant on a reef system. And so if those economies fall globally, that will be impacted. Pharmaceuticals, many of the compounds that are used in our drugs come from things that are in the marine environment. So there's just all of these sort of associated services that all come back to the reef.
But I would say also, in Australia, the reef is part of our identity. We are so proud that we have this wonder, this gift on in the back that that we've taken for granted, that many of us have got phenomenal memories of growing up. It's just part of us. And we were saying before we were backstage, our parents perhaps didn't know the impact of their behaviours. We know the impact of our behaviours and how they're playing out in oceans and places like the Great Barrier Reef. So we live in an amazing time of great challenge, but we also live in an amazing time of great opportunity. So the reality is for us, it's just in our core to do what we can. Yes, there's the economics, and yes, there is the life and death which is playing out in a lot of coral reef communities. But certainly in Australia, when you talk to people, they just feel compelled to do everything they can to protect these ecosystems.
Emily, I know that you spend a lot of time talking about plastics and the impact of plastics. And I think we've all read about this great Pacific garbage patch that has been growing at a great rate. What impact is that plastic having on reefs?
That's a great question, thank you. And I think Emma gave a great explanation of what a coral is, but when we think about coral reefs, a healthy coral reef is really a healthy ecosystem that is teeming with wildlife, is teeming with fish. And one of the most concerning statistics we know about plastic in the ocean is that plastic in the ocean has been shown to impact over 800 marine species, whether it's because they're getting entangled in marine plastic or if it's because they're ingesting it and getting harmed by it. And this pollution, this plastic pollution, is impacting wildlife across the ocean. It's not just in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. We find plastic all the way from the Arctic sea ice down to the beaches of St. Kilda here in Australia. And that's because our estimates show right now that there's over 8 million metric tons of plastic that's getting into the ocean every year.
Every year.
Every year, which, let me give you something a little bit more tangible. That amounts to one city garbage truck of plastic every minute.
Wow.
So in terms of the impacts, it's certainly impacting the marine wildlife. There's also starting to be some research to understand how it contributes as just one of the many stressors on the reef systems itself. And so there was a recent article in the last couple of months that said that the presence of plastics in reef systems increases the incidence of disease in the corals, perhaps from as much as 4% to 90%. Perhaps because it's blocking sunlight from the reef or actually releasing toxins and chemicals that make the reef more vulnerable to disease.
Are some of these plastics entering our food chain?
Oh, absolutely. So certain recent research has shown that if you look at fish on market shelves, I think they sampled in Indonesia and in California, up to 25% of the fish that they pulled just off the shelf in the market had plastics in its belly and its food system. Now, what that impact is for human health, honestly, the answer is we don't know yet. Researchers, including some fabulous female researchers, Dr. Chelsea Rockman being a key one of them, are looking into what are the impacts on human health of eating fish that has eaten plastic. But it's an active area of research. We don't have the answer yet, but I'm guessing it's not sort of a healthy additive.
Guessing. Did we have seafood for lunch today? No, we didn't. Emma, I've seen ocean warming and ocean acidification referred to as the evil twins when it comes to our oceans. Why are they the principal culprits? Are they the principal culprits in the decline of the ocean?
So, yeah, they are definitely up there as two of the key, I guess, evil culprits that are affecting the reef. I would actually argue that there's a third, which is deoxygenation, and so there's this trio of stresses. And they all come back to the effects of excess carbon dioxide being given off into the atmosphere, and that gets trapped inside, and it causes the oceans to warm up. So the ocean actually absorbs about 90% of the carbon dioxide that's given off in the atmosphere. And if it didn't do that, the temperature on Earth would be a lot warmer and it would not be a particularly pleasant place to live. But that comes at a great cost to the chemistry and the ocean health. So the absorption of that carbon dioxide causes the ocean to get hotter. We've heard about the bleaching events and the El Nino stresses. That relates to that temperature. It also causes the acidity of the water to increase. So when that carbon dioxide is absorbed, there's a lot of chemistry that changes, and I won't go into that and bore everybody with that. But the result of that is that it becomes more acidic. And that's a problem for anything that builds a calcium carbonate structure, like we said corals have. And you can imagine ocean acidification being analogous to osteoporosis of the sea. It's a weathering of these structures. And then on top of that, you've got lower oxygen. So basically, as the ocean gets warmer, the capacity to store oxygen gets reduced. Things require more oxygen as the temperature increases. So you can see how together this really causes a trio of stresses that all marine life, not just the reefs, are going to have to contend with.
Is this just part of a normal cycle?
So that's a very good question. And, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about identifiable changes that we can show through scientific studies and historical records that has accelerated by human impact. So there are always oscillations, there's always variance, but we can see from the Industrial Revolution onwards that the amount of carbon dioxide that's being produced has just exponentially increased, and it is continuing to increase. So we can really attribute these differences in the oceans back to the activities of humans.
So this is the ocean. Can't a lot of the wildlife just move to warmer waters?
Or cooler waters. So that's really interesting. Some of the work that I'm involved in at the moment is looking at tropicalisation. So I'm based in Sydney, and so Sydney's a bit cooler, and there's been suggested that, corals and fish and things can just move, and Sydney Harbour will have the next barrier reef. But unfortunately, the stresses that we've just talked about, so low oxygen and the pH of the water and the temperature, actually all work against each other. So where temperature is cooler, acidity is actually worse. And so the ability for these corals just to move, and it takes a really long time for corals. They've got spawning, and it's not like they can just quickly disperse at the same rate. So realistically, that's not going to be a solution.
But are there some winners in warming oceans? Algae, for instance, I would think would be a winner.
I mean, I'm not sure if anyone would say that there's so much winners, but there's certainly what we're seeing now is survivors. What we're seeing is certain resilience that we always knew. I mean, all coral reefs have been extremely resilient, and that's probably why it's the response and the solution is such a new era for us, because for so many years, for hundreds of years, the best way to manage a coral reef has been to humans get out of its way and let it recover and let it bounce back and let it go through its natural cycles. What we've seen in the last couple of years is that these incidents, these holy trio, plus cyclones, which is another form of changing climate, is meaning that the incidents are getting more severe and they're just not having the recovery windows for the system to recover itself. So we're entering this new era where the only solution is for humans to come in and help, whether it be through intervention, whether it be to help reduce the pressures and the other stresses on the system, whether it be to think outside the box of how do we learn and I guess help the survivors to be the ones that prevail. So this is all still quite new because we are in a new era of managing coral reefs around the world.
Interesting that you mentioned cyclones. Those are destructive to the reefs.
Very much so.
And yet they provide protection for the land, correct?
Well, and not only that, if you want to think about the crazy, I mean, thank you, Mother Nature, you're special, but there's times. The crazy thing that happens is that the saviour of the last two coral bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef was cyclones coming in and cooling down the waters. If we hadn't have had these cyclones, the waters would have remained heating and we would have lost more. However, the cyclones themselves, the pathway that the cyclone follows, it pretty much carves a sort of a 3-kilometre destruction point. The one perk of that a cyclone would have of its damage over a coral bleaching event is that it just sort of cracks off the coral and forces and relocates it. So you end up with a bunch of rubble, but the coral itself is still alive and can resettle. And so you would see, if we're in normal times, if you would go back to a coral reef after a cyclone 3 or 4 years, it would look perfect. A coral bleaching, 8 to 10 years. So it's a different recovery window for these kind of incidents.
You talked about mankind and the impact it is having, and I will have a polling question for the audience. So if you don't have your phones out, take them out now, and here's the question. Do you support more offshore oil and gas drilling? Go to your phone, vote yes, or vote no. So at the moment, this is a pretty hot area of debate here in Australia because there's talk of drilling in the Great Australian Bight. From your perspective, what's at stake?
Look, I think we've spent the first 20, 25 minutes talking about the pressures that oceans are under. And so I think we have got to really recognise everything we can do to de-risk further incidents happening to these special systems as better as that. I think the challenge that we're finding with this debate, and it is a welcome debate because it is about a collision of beliefs and it's showing that we are going on a journey to try to transition to better behaviours with the planet in our minds. But I think the challenge that often happens is it comes down to our project and people try to find a villain. This company, this politician, you did something wrong. The reality is, if you step it up a little bit, climate change is all of us. You know, this is a consequence of our lifestyle, and we all have a role to play in changing that lifestyle, in considering the planet, in considering oceans. So with these incidents and these debates about mining, to turn around and say that's the culprit here, that's the villain, and then to think we've stopped that, we're good. That is. It's not looking at the big picture. So I get concerned about sometimes the localising of these debates, where in the end, we need to look at this holistically and look at the journey that we can all play.
Anna, Emily, did you want to weigh in on the offshore drilling question?
I just think that last point is really important, right? That we tend to focus on the things that are easiest to focus on and easiest to stop and easiest to identify as sort of a bad practice or a bad villain, and understanding that if we really want to have healthy oceans, we've got to keep plastic out of the ocean. We've got to be very careful about destroying habitat and be cautious about if we're going to do any offshore drilling where that happens. But we also have to look at these sort of broader systemic problems like carbon pollution, like climate change. And so I think as an advocate, as a conservationist, it's really exciting to see people understand and care about the issue of when they use a straw, when they use a plastic bottle, where does that go and does that impact the ocean? But it can't stop there. That has to be the beginning of a conversation, not the end.
I think we have the polling results. I hope we do. Let's put them up here. Looks like the no's vastly outnumbered the yeses when it came to this matter of offshore drilling. Very lively debate in many parts of the globe because we are still so fossil fuel dependent. You mentioned briefly there another factor, deforestation. Are you seeing on the Great Barrier Reef the impact of deforestation and runoff from the land and what it's doing?
So if climate change was threat number one, and it's sort of with quite an advance, it's really winning the race. Yeah. Threat number two would be water quality. And there's a combination of impacts with that. It's really about excess sediment, which is just stuff and dirt, excess nitrogen and pesticides, and that's coming from farming. Queensland is a big banana, sugarcane farming sort of area. And so there's a long-standing practice of over-fertilisation. And what you also get in the tropics is you get moments of great dry and you get moments of great wet seasons. And so what happens is you've got these dry gullies that when the wet season comes in, it just washes everything out. And that's clogging the inner shore reefs. But the excess nitrogen, the excess pesticides, that's playing out in quite an evil little area where we've got these crown of thorns starfish. And you think of starfish and you think of Little Mermaid and these adorable things. These are ugly starfish, black things. They can spit these things out.
And they eat coral.
And they eat coral. They eat like a dinner plate size of coral a day. And so it's quite tragic. You've got these corals that are surviving everything else, and then these munchers come along and eat them.
And are they benefiting by some of the changes in ocean chemistry that we've been talking about? Is that why they're proliferating?
No, what happens for them is that the excess nitrogen is almost like a spring break element. And they go into mass breeding, and so they're in plague proportions. So they love to get their jiggy on with the nitrogen. So that's an issue. So we're trying to track. So that water quality is leading to not just pollution in the water, but it's these things are what is it, like 200,000 one mother can. It's crazy.
And I think we have some video.
Breeders.
We have some video of a new technology that you're deploying to try and cope with these starfish.
Yeah, so this
you
is
can go
cool.
out there one by one and try and handle them, but you guys are harnessing technology here.
Yeah, so last year we won the Google Impact Challenge with this thing called RangerBot. And it's this robot that can go out, and it's got a smart sight on it, and it can spot crown of thorn starfish, and it shoots them with a little saline solution. And the great thing about it is at the moment that's being done by hand. And so you're limited to a certain number of hours a day, good weather, can't go where there's crocodiles. These robots, a single RangerBot robot will do the same work of 50 human divers. And with the Google grant, it's taken the cost price from $100,000 a unit to $5,000 and made them really easy to deploy. Awesome.
So this goes to that artificial intelligence we were talking about earlier.
Army of things. Yeah. And then another really cool thing is that you can basically pull the chip out and put a new brain in so they can be trained to survey fish size or look at plastics. So there's a lot of different things you can do. So it's a really good step change of automation in marine management.
I want to go to some plastic solutions. Before we do, again, we have another polling question for you, so let's ask about that. Would you, out there in the audience, support restrictions on plastics to reduce ocean garbage? Could you live with that? Again, it's a yes or no question. Emily, there are efforts to limit plastics. I've read about bans on styrofoam in some parts of the world. Is that an effective way to approach the problem?
I think bans can be an important part of the solution, just like every major global challenge, which plastic in the ocean is. It's going to take a range of solutions to really tackle this issue. So there was hopefully a graph that was showing earlier when we were talking about this issue, which shows that what we understand from research that's been done is that over half the plastic in the ocean comes from 5 countries that happen to be in Asia right now. And it's not that they're countries in Asia, it's that you actually have emerging economies with large populations, and that economic growth happens to be in Asia right now, where people are, large numbers of people are able to consume and purchase consumer goods that are wrapped in plastic in countries and economies that haven't yet kept pace with waste management infrastructure. And so that's where we're seeing a lot of plastic, quote unquote, leaking into the ocean.
And I do think we have a couple of visuals here that show the plastics piling up. on the
Yeah,
shoreline.
when the Ocean Conservancy hosts the International Coastal Cleanup, when I go to a beach cleanup, my beach doesn't look like this, right? My beach looks like there are a couple of food wrappers, but this is what we see on many of the beaches where we do cleanups around the world. And again, it's this sort of it's a dual problem of a make, take, dispose sort of economy, right? Where we're okay with single-use products. But it's also become really problematic in countries where we don't have even the basic waste collection systems in place to recover those materials.
So is that the way to address it, to develop better systems?
So yes. So I think what we think is that about 20% of the products out there we could get rid of. We don't need them or they're problematic. Styrofoam, it's brittle, it breaks into a million pieces, get rid of it. We don't really need microbeads of plastic in our toothpaste and our face cream. So there's 20% you could deal with that way. 30% could probably be of single-use plastics could be redesigned to be multi-use. In the hotel, you get a little individual bottle of shampoo. Why not have a dispenser that can be refilled? But that leaves about 50% of the plastic out there, plastic packaging, that's actually serving a pretty good purpose, might in fact have some environmental benefits, and that we're going to need to find a way to recycle. So there are all these sort of design changes that need to happen in terms of the way we produce goods, but at the same time, we have to make sure that the collection and infrastructure systems are in place in these emerging economies to actually take all that recyclable material and make sure it actually gets recycled.
I read all the time about alternative products, replacements for plastics. Has anything come along?
Yeah,
You want to jump in here?
Yeah, so at the university we've got a whole department that's actually working on bioplastics and looking at plastic that can come from algae and basically will degrade over very short spaces of time to exactly try to fill the product where there is a need for packaging or there is a need for something maybe that is single use that we can't just immediately replace. So there's definitely a whole area where the technology now needs to come and meet with the design needs to bridge that gap.
I think we have to be careful, though, a word of caution, right? So everybody is looking for biodegradable plastic. Well, does that mean when you're done with your plastic bottle, it's okay to just throw it on the side of the road? Right? Like, we don't want to encourage that behavior. We're still going to need waste management systems. And the things that make plastic useful, right? It's light, it's cheap, it is impervious to water, it doesn't react with anything, are the things that make it difficult to deal with at the end of its life. So I think there are absolutely some innovations we can make in design, either in the material itself or in the format, but we have to make sure that we have waste collection systems and that any waste we produce, whether it's from plastic or something else, is appropriately managed and kept out of the environment.
Let's take a look at those poll results. We asked how people felt about bans on plastic. And yes,
It's pretty compelling.
restrictions on plastics way up
Well.
there. Good. Is that 100%? Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty
You
incredible.
can leave Australia. You've achieved
Yeah.
You know, I have never
you.
seen this group agree on everything completely, but they have here. That's pretty remarkable. What about bacteria? I've read about plastic-eating bacteria. Is that something that's anywhere near deployable, or is that pie in the sky?
Yeah, I mean, we were excited about that when we saw that as well, and we reached out to some of the scientists we work with, and they said, we're in early stages here, that the bacteria, the mutant enzymes that we found, that the type of plastic they eat is plastic that already kind of breaks down with water, and in fact, it breaks down faster with water. So we're not quite there, but you know, there are tons of people working on this, the sort of the innovation and design piece of this, whether it's, like I said, from the formats to the materials to new technologies that will help us either break down or actually chemically recycle plastic. So I'm quite impressed with the amount of entrepreneurial spirit there is in this field.
But it isn't just about technology, it is also about biology. Emma, tell us what you're doing with corals. You have found some corals that actually are more resilient. Where have you found them? What are you doing with them?
So when I say I'm a marine biologist and I get to work on the reef, people are like, oh, you've got my dream job. And then I tell them that I go into the smelly crocodile, shark-infested mangroves, and their sort of view of that job changes a little bit. But it's really important because actually we've seen that if we look into these environments that are less attractive and have poorer water quality just naturally, they're hotter, they're more acidic, they have lower oxygen just because of the type of environment that it is. They're the stresses that we're seeing increasing with climate change. So if we look at the corals that live there naturally, we can start to try to understand which corals can survive there and how they have managed to survive there. So I look at the genetics and the physiology of some really tough corals that are living surprisingly in mangrove lagoons and really turbid inshore environments. But these corals have found a way to survive very extreme conditions. And while that shouldn't tell us all that we can sit back and the reef's going to be fine, that's definitely not what these corals tell us at all. But what they do is they tell us that there is a way for some corals to survive, and so which corals is it? If we're going to look at potentially restoration or mitigation efforts into the future, let's look to nature first to see which corals have found a way to do that and how can we boost them, and that goes on to some work that's done, for example, in labs to try to genetically enhance some of those corals.
Essentially breeding corals in the
Exactly.
lab that then would be transplanted out to the reef.
Yeah, and I think I think the key thing with the stress that's on the reef is that it's the time at which it's occurring. So we're seeing changes in temperatures we've heard before occurring in such short timescales that the time for corals to adapt and acclimate and see the genetic changes in the DNA to build resilience is becoming challenging. So we may need to look to the lab to try to facilitate that process.
I have one more polling question for you. This one is about marine sanctuaries that are essentially national parks, but in the ocean. So do you support that approach? Pull out your phones. Once again, vote yes or no. While you're voting, let me ask your opinions. Is this an effective management technique? Is it enough?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Great Barrier Reef is one of the largest marine parks in the world, and you'll hear that overfishing is not in the top 5 threats, and that's because it's a protected area. And it's actively managed, and there's certain areas where you can't fish, and there's certain areas you can't put your boat. But it's under a watchful eye, and they have a long-term plan for building and enhancing the resilience of this system.
But there are many other nations that don't have the wealth that Australia has.
Absolutely.
And they do have reefs. Are these sanctuaries big enough? Can they be policed adequately for them to be effective? What do you think?
Yeah, so I did a lot of research in the Cayman Islands and around some of the areas in the Caribbean, and some of those locations have got some of the most effective marine sanctuaries in those areas through local custodians and also from countries that, for example, the United Kingdom has obviously overseas territories. And so I think that there are countries, smaller than Australia, but that have really shown that marine protected areas do play a huge effect. And although, as we said before, we can think of climate change as the number one threat as being sort of the underlying, ongoing chronic disease that's affecting, the reef. But that doesn't mean that if you were an individual and that you say had cancer but had a broken leg, that we wouldn't deal with the broken leg. We have to deal with these other stresses as well, and that's where the marine parks really become crucial in the reef's future.
And I think recent research, are they effective, are they important? Not just yes, but hell yes. I think the recent research suggests that we'd love to have, or we need really 30% of the ocean in protection.
How much is protected now?
Very little. I think we're in single digits. Now, we've actually made some great strides in recent years. There have been some international conferences, actually, that have created a world stage for countries to come forward. Chile, Malta, the U.S., I think Indonesia's hosting the next conference to announce these major marine protected areas. So they're incredibly important, but enforcement is key, right? Just having some lines on a map saying that's protected doesn't help. And so I think the point Emma made about sort of working with local communities, having local buy-in, right? Coastal communities understand the value of the resources that are out there, that they benefit from. Fishermen, once they see that the protected area actually has larger biodiversity and that now they can fish on the side of the protected area just over the line and there's plentiful fish species, right, can be bought in to help make sure that these things actually mean something. And I think, honestly, we're starting to see a lot of the remote sensing technologies out there as they're developing, whether it's, it used to be satellite imagery, now you can send a drone out there, where you're starting to be able to make some advances in monitoring and enforcing and making sure that those areas actually are protected.
Let's take a quick look at the poll results on marine sanctuaries. Yes, overwhelming support for this one too, 98%. Australia, the government of Australia has just pledged a big pot of money, towards protection of the Great Barrier Reef. How significant is that money? How's it going to be spent? How far will it go? Is it enough?
Well, it's the largest environmental investment in Australia's history. So on Sunday, the Australian government announced $500 million for protection of the Great Barrier Reef. And that will go to a series of areas that I guess they believe will make a difference in building the resilience of the system. So there's a big piece of work around water quality, reducing what happens on the land and gets to the ocean. There's a big piece about those crown-of-thorns starfish, because we've got to get rid of those. There's a big piece of funding around coral reef science, around restoration and adaptation, with the idea that that may end up being a plan B, but increasingly that may be plan A. How can we rebuild and restore the reefs that we've lost if the natural ability of the reefs to reseed themselves diminishes? And then there's a big piece of work about monitoring and modelling, because essentially that's the tools that a doctor has to diagnose what's going on. Unless we can see what's going on, we can't diagnose. So collectively, this suite of work is the best chance, and I think it's had unanimous support from the conservation and the marine science community around Australia of this is what happened. We need this. It's a big challenge, and it needed a big piece of investment, because that's the challenge that a lot of the developing countries that also have the gift of coral reefs, they don't have strategic sustained finance. I think what it also shows is that Australia recognises that it's a wealthy country. We have great mines, and we have a large reef that still has much diversity, so we've got a great lab. This, in a lot of ways, is our problem to lead and our problem to solve. If we can't get our act together, if we can't crack the code and find some solutions and then share that tech with the world, then we are in trouble. And I think if you have to go to a certain research meeting recently, there is so much more collaborative spirit and unified spirit of we've got to do everything we can. And that's only been emerging in the last couple of years. But this funding goes to the heart of that. So it's certainly welcome. And now we have the responsibility to make sure it gets us where we have to get.
We have some microphones out there in the audience. We'd love to take some of your questions. If you want to stand and go to the mics, we will come to you. This is action by one government, though. And when the primary issue is global warming, this isn't about one country's investment, is it?
No, and it's not even about governments. It's about everybody. There's phenomenal corporates out there that have been investing in coral reef protection for 20 years. There's individuals, there's philanthropists, there's school kids. I mean, the world is turning on to this issue and is doing their part, absolutely.
Any questions out there? Anybody at the mic? You have these three brilliant women here talking about oceans, but I'm not seeing anyone out there. You mentioned corporate. You see all sorts of gestures from the corporate community. Adidas recently, for instance, said it's going to be making a sneaker.
They're cool sneakers.
Out of recycled ocean plastic.
Yeah.
Is this just a gesture? Is this just window dressing? Or do you think that these sorts of contributions really will make a difference?
Well, so I would say we absolutely have to have corporations at the table to solve this challenge. I mean, they're the ones who are making the products, particularly on the issue of ocean
plastics,
right? They're the ones who are making the products in the first place. They're the ones who need to be working with us and with governments to help solve the problem. I think that we struggle a little bit about the things that are more appealing on a marketing side. I think actually the Adidas program is particularly focused on recovering plastic from derelict and abandoned fishing nets and turning them into sneakers. That's incredibly important. Fishing gear is designed to kill marine animals, and so it turns out even when it's not being deployed, intentionally, it's just sort of left in the ocean, that it's particularly deadly to marine wildlife. So let's get that out of the ocean. But what I'm more excited about is a lot of the collaborative spaces where corporations are coming together. We work with a number of them, with Coca-Cola, with Dow, with Procter & Gamble, with Unilever, with others, in a group we formed called the Trash Receipts Alliance, to specifically look at this issue about how can corporations engage and work to support waste management to deal with stopping plastic from getting into the ocean. There are others who are working with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. There are others who are now working with the World Economic Forum. There are others who are working together in the space of the World Business Council on Sustainable Development to figure out what should they be doing individually, but also what should they be doing collectively as an industry to move towards more sustainable practices. And we are seeing, and actually we're in an age where there's a ton of pressure on these corporates to make commitments around what they're going to do. And so we've seen Evian and Coca-Cola and recently Nestle and Unilever and Amcor and a bunch of companies come out, particularly with commitments to creating recyclable products. And just to be sort of savvy consumers and tell the sort of the good from the greenwashing, if I can be a little provocative. Making your products recyclable is great. That's an important first step. We want to see all corporations move in that direction. But those beaches that were in Ghana and in Indonesia, where there is no collection system in place, that putting recyclable products on the market just means you will end up with recyclable plastic in the ocean. And so we want to look at how do we adjust, how do we influence the markets and the systems. And so what we actually are pushing companies to do is to make commitments to incorporating recycled content in their packaging, right? So to help create demand for recycled content to help support those waste management collection systems.
It looks to me like we have a question out there. Can we?
Hi, good afternoon, ladies. Giselle from Trinidad. It's a perfect segue to my question. I wanted to ask if there was any country that was successfully and profitably recycling plastic packaging, and is it that the profits are not there because we're capitalists at heart primarily, so you would think that other countries would be motivated to replicate that, and then we could possibly address this global problem. Do you know of any countries that are successfully recycling their packaging?
Recycling around the world is not doing very well, and it needs to be subsidized sort of by industry, preferably, right, to sort of internalize the externality of the products that they're putting out there, but also by governments and municipalities who see waste management sort of as a public service, a public good. I think particularly the problem of plastic in the ocean has started to get attention a lot of the consumer goods companies and plastic makers to understand that this, making recycling economically sustainable, economically viable, is something that will be transformative at scale and really allow us to solve the problem. So people are actively working on that piece. Right now, the problem is trash collection costs money, recycling isn't valuable enough, virgin plastic is still too cheap, and so the economics aren't quite there. There's some complications depending on the country. In developed economies like Germany and other places in Europe where they've implemented sort of container deposit schemes and extended producer responsibilities to sort of bring corporations into paying for collection, we see higher recycling rates. But even there, it's not great. So I think there are a number of things that are happening. We're working on a policy front to try and figure out how can corporations and the governments work together to make sure collection systems are in place. There's a lot of technology and R&D going into new ways of recycling. A lot of recycling now is done mechanically. Can we chemically recycle products to sort of increase the amount of material that can be profitably recycled? And all these sort of design challenges, right? How do we make things that are easier to recycle? How do we lower the cost of recycling? So I think all those things have to move in parallel, right? The policy, the infrastructure, and the design elements. And that's why these collaborative spaces for public and private entities to come together to work on solutions are so important.
And we have another question. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Monica from the Trinidad and Tobago chapter. Just to go back a little bit, when they were talking about the effects of plastics, there is some evidence that the denigration of plastics, the reheating of plastics, obviously releases dioxins. And it has been recently shown that dioxins do have an association with endometriosis, which is affiliated with infertility and vice versa. So I thought I would just share that for those who may not have known.
Great. Thank you for that insight. And I think someone else is right there.
Alison Taunton-Rigby, I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm curious about the big patch in the middle of the Pacific. Is anybody doing anything to try and deal with that? Can we not have an international effort to remove that somehow? What is going to be done about that big patch?
So one of the pictures earlier that was shown should have been a picture of the ocean and plastic in the ocean. That's actually what that garbage patch looks like, right? There's a lot of myths out there that it is an island the size of Texas that you can walk across. What it really is it is about the size of Texas, but it's an area where there's a larger concentration of plastic in the ocean. And there are a number of people who are working on technologies to try and clean the ocean. There are a couple of things we have to be careful about. We have to make sure that when they're scooping plastic out of the ocean, they're not scooping other marine life out, that they're not in the way of ships or entangling marine animals. But a lot of them have some really serious science support, and so I'm confident they'll figure that out. So I think that that's definitely something we'll see move into as we move into the future. One of my questions is whether or not that's sort of where we want to focus our priority. So I mentioned that there's 8 million metric tons of plastic going in every year. Some of the estimates I've seen from some of the most well-funded and sort of advanced efforts to try and clean the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, their estimates at full deployment, and they're just in a piloting stage right now, but at full deployment, they would be able to clean 3,600 tons of plastic a year, right? So about 4,000 tons. Compared to 8 million, you know, for us it feels a little bit like when a pipe bursts in your house, you don't grab a bucket and start bailing out your, the basement. You figure out how to turn off the tap first. That said, cleanup is an important part of the solution, and I think we want to encourage those efforts and encourage people to engage. But even for our own institution, I would encourage everybody to look around in your local community and see if there's a beach cleanup. We help work with partners around the world to host the International Coastal Cleanup the third Saturday in September. And our volunteers go out and they collect 8,000 tons of trash in one day. So, I think we want to, as we start looking at how do we collect plastic that's already entered into the environment, we'd prefer to get it either at the beach or scoop it out of the river before it's had a chance to move into the ocean. But the truth is everybody's working on all parts of that solution, the ocean, the river, the beaches, and further upstream.
In fact, I've seen a couple of contraptions out on the river here,
yeah,
right outside, that are designed, obviously, to catch the plastic as it goes down. Let's quickly get to another question.
Thank you. I'm Julia Charlton from Hong Kong. Whilst moves towards collaboration, corporate goals, and attempts to shift consumer behaviour are clearly excellent and all moves in the right direction, I'm interested in the panel's views as to whether the time has not now come for serious legislation to be enacted by, say, all the G20 countries, for example, to wholly or partly ban plastic bottles and plastic packaging, and whether the time for piecemeal efforts is really over and it's too late.
Heavy policy question, ladies.
So those conversations are happening, and in fact, I think we have a large Canadian contingent here. The Canadians, as the hosts, as the leaders of the G7 this year, are going to focus on marine plastics as part of that. The UN has had several major meetings and is having sort of scoping meetings to talk about treaties. I think that our push would be that whatever we do on that is, again, my breakdown is there's probably 20% you can ban, 30% you need to redesign, and 50% we'll need to recycle. It's back to this comment of like, I don't want us to deal with the most tangible, easy, low-hanging fruit and then say we're done. If we ban all plastic bottles and all plastic bags, I think that would be wonderful in reducing our environmental footprint in general, but it's actually going to have a fairly small impact on the ocean. And so I think, yes, the time for piecemeal action is done. A lot of people are figuring out how to add up the broader pieces, but that's got to look at a holistic, systemic approach.
I want to wrap up by asking each one of you what we as leaders can do that will be meaningful and effective to make change in this area. Emma, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, for me, I think it's regardless of what your position is or what your job is to engage in this issue, and especially, say, for us here talking about the reef. You may not live by a reef, you may never have visited a reef, but you are connected to the reef in some way by your actions, and you will be impacted by it, whether it's through an economy or a product or just for the social value that has. And so look within your own institutions and your daily life to see how you can engage in the problems we've discussed today and really look for some solutions, because it's not going to be just scientists, it's not going to be just policymakers, it's going to take the community and the leaders like that we have in this room to come together to solve these global issues.
Anna?
Look, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the biggest threat that faces coral reefs in the oceans is apathy.
Yeah.
Is us all thinking this is an impossible downer of an issue and I'll move on to something else. We must lean into this as leaders. We must become blue literate. We must understand, and then we must also think, well, what can I bring? Is it about having a conversation around the dinner table? Is it my leader of an organisation talking to my employees and making changes? Bring what you can, whether it's from science, whether it's from an NGO perspective. All of us have a role to play in this because this is our planet we're talking about.
Yeah, I would say, so start at home and move from there. Do your own waste audit, right? Do your own plastics audit, whether it's in your own household, in your office, in your supply chain, in your procurement policies, and the purchases that your companies make, and figure out where are the single-use plastics that you're interacting with or that you're responsible for taking part in. Do you need them? Can you get rid of them altogether? Are there purchases or procurement policies where you could favor recyclable materials or even better materials and packaging made out of recycled content? So I would, start as a consumer. Skip the straw. Ask your local restaurant, your favorite restaurant, to only give out straws if people ask for them rather than automatically. But take that all the way from home as far as you can in terms of the impact that you can have on your partners, your supply chains, and the other businesses and governments that you interact with.
And we have to leave it there. Emily, Anna, Emma, thank you all for joining us here today. Thank you for being a great audience.
Thank you.
I think we're all going to look at our oceans a little differently after this. And all of you have a great afternoon. Enjoy your behind-the-scenes excursions. Take care.